Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. We're jumping right into a seriously fascinating piece of metaphysical sci-fi. We're unpacking Elias LUV Thorne's novel, The Omniscient Tapestry. This story explores a civilization that suddenly, just completely out of nowhere, loses its interior walls. And I'm not talking about physical bricks and mortar here. We're talking about the psychological barriers that separate you from me or us from them. The whole beating heart of our Explainer today actually stems from this one massive question. What happens when those walls dissolve not as philosophy, but as brute, undeniable physiological fact? We aren't just talking about a nice metaphor you might hear at a weekend meditation retreat, right? We are talking about billions of people waking up and experiencing a biological, inescapable reality where the very boundary of self literally just evaporates.
So, I want you to seriously ask yourself right now, what would you do if your separation from everything else suddenly disappeared? Imagine sitting exactly where you are and suddenly you feel the consciousness of the person walking outside, the roots of the trees beneath your building, even the mind of someone you'd consider an enemy. How on earth would you go to work? How would you fight a war? Honestly, how would civilization even function?
Section 1. The Illusion of Separation. To really wrap our heads around the impact of this event, we first got to understand the world it actually happens to. The Consolidated Empire is a society that has spent 300 years literally perfecting the architecture of separation. It's a world built entirely on borders, rigid military lines, and a deeply dualistic worldview. And we see this ultimate clash of perspectives play out. On one side, you've got General Marin Ostov. He spent 41 years staring at maps, drawing military lines, and finding professional comfort in a world with very sharp edges. But then, on the flip side, we have Nara, a peasant farmer. Her hands are constantly in the soil, dealing with drainage and roots that extend infinitely under the earth. She inherently ignores those arbitrary lines drawn by men like Ostov.
Now, in the world of the novel, the state that General Ostov operates in is called the forgetting. And interestingly enough, this isn't presented as a flaw. It's actually a completely necessary coping strategy. Think about it. You can't successfully command an army, paint a portrait, or even harvest a crop if you're simultaneously experiencing the consciousness of the soil and the enemy troops. You absolutely need that illusion of separation just to get out of bed and function in a civilized society.
Section 2. The Great Shift. So what happens when that coping strategy completely fails? Well, this brings us to a massive civilization-wide anomaly known simply as the shift. And before the main event even hits, there are these tremors. Take the young soldier Dave Ostov, for example, the general's son. He's lying in a ditch, and suddenly, the sky, the ground, and his own awareness become one seamless physiological fact. The quote really nails it. The noticing was the size of what contains all comparisons. He suddenly realizes the awareness looking at the sky and the sky itself, well, they aren't two different things. He is the noticing, and it is vast. The crucial point here is understanding exactly what broke. The author defines this mechanism as the subject-object membrane. You can think of it like this invisible cognitive wall that divides you, the experiencer, from the world you're experiencing. And during the shift, this membrane completely collapses across the entire Valdrath Plateau. Literally all at once, every single person loses their boundaries. And they don't just sympathize with each other, they literally experience being each other.
The direct impact of this is absolutely staggering. You have General Ostov suddenly inside the mind of his sworn enemy, General Avra Centenay. He feels her profound compassion for him, but from the inside. Meanwhile, you have Sura the painter. She finally realizes why she hasn't been able to paint separate faces for months. Her canvas has been demanding she paint the unified, shared awareness that exists right underneath our individual features. It's like finding the shared light inside the lantern, so to speak. And the specific feeling that accompanies this wild event actually has an ancient pre-empire name, verath. It's a shock of recognizing what was already here. You see, it's not about learning something new, it's a profound remembering. It's this wild realization that you knew about this absolute infinite connection all along, but you had just forgotten it so you could survive.
Section 3. Bureaucracy meets the infinite.
Now, eventually, the shift ends. The membrane returns and people are themselves again. But the catch is, they remember it all. So how does an empire built entirely on borders react to undeniable proof that those borders are fake? Well, they form a committee, of course. The Commission on Anomalous Collective Experience spends years drafting this 17-volume report. And their findings are just a hilariously dry way of handling mass enlightenment.
They confirm the shift happened everywhere simultaneously. They admit science has absolutely no idea why. They determine that no legislative action should be taken because you can't exactly legislate against the universe. And perhaps most radically, they suggest military ethics might need a thorough review, now that everyone knows killing the enemy literally means killing a version of yourself.
But the ultimate radical concession from this whole bureaucratic nightmare is summed up in one very famous phrase: the map is not the territory. The consolidated empire is finally forced to admit that their entire civilization of separation, their walls, their borders, their military ranks, it's all just a map. It's just a tool. And having experienced the actual unified territory firsthand during the shift, well, they can no longer unsee the truth.
Section 4. The Art of Remembering.
Okay, so the government writes a 17-volume report that changes almost nothing overnight. Par for the course, right? But what about everyday people? How do they actually integrate this world-shattering knowledge into their lives? A quiet, completely unorganized resistance begins to form. They're called the Rememberers. They don't have a leader, there's no grand manifesto. Instead, they just use simple practices to keep that cognitive membrane thin. We're talking about soldiers taking 10 minutes of absolute silence before their military watch, or farmers singing ancient calendar songs to connect with the earth. They use these incredibly small acts as a sort of technology to keep the truth of the shift alive in a world that desperately demands they forget.
Naturally, art becomes a massive battleground for this truth. On one hand, you have institutional art. Commissioned by the empire, it demands hierarchy and separation. Think grand paintings of emperors looking infinitely superior to peasants. But Sura's studio art is doing something completely different. She starts creating these brutally honest works that reveal the shared consciousness behind every single face. Her paintings become a literal technology for anyone who looks at them, actively helping the viewer's own membrane thin out.
And the craziest part? This phenomenon isn't just a one-time fluke, it's entirely cyclical. Look at the timeline here. 60 years ago, an elder named Marette's grandmother experienced what she called the unraveling of the net. Fast forward to the present day, and we have the Great Shift. Then, just 3 years later, a second tremor begins, signaled by the changing autumn light. It clearly shows this is a natural, recurring correction to human forgetting. Reality is going to continually remind us of what we truly are.
Section 5. Living Beyond the Walls.
So here is the big question. How exactly do you live, fight, or farm when you know for a fact that you are everything? You obviously can't just sit in a field staring at the sky forever. Society still has to function. The pragmatic philosophy they land on is incredibly powerful. Step 1. You recognize that the walls are merely a choice, a management strategy, not a fundamental fact. Step 2. You continue the necessary daily work. You still harvest the food. You still do your job. But step 3 is the kicker. You act knowing the immense cost of that separation. You don't stop functioning, but you now operate with this profound, undeniable awareness. And we get to see this integration directly in the characters. For instance, opposing generals Ostov and Sen literally meet unarmed at a river ford just to maintain a parallel line of honesty outside their official military channels. Dave Ostov stays a soldier, but he completely drops the psychological numbness of the us versus them narrative, because he knows he is pointing a weapon at a version of himself. And Nara, the peasant, well, she plants her seeds not as a chore, but as a conscious, ongoing conversation with the whole earth.
This all leads us to the story's ultimate realization, perfectly captured by Nara out in the fields. Spring comes whether you believe in it or not. The truth of our profound interconnectedness, the sheer brute reality that we are all extensions of the exact same awareness, persists entirely regardless of the walls we build to hide from it.
Which brings us to the end of today's explainer, and I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If you knew right now, as a brute physiological fact, that your walls, your judgments, your enemies, your borders were just a choice, what would you do with them? I really want you to think about that as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the Omniscient Tapestry. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.